Good morning, everybody. My name is Jessica Pulliam, and I am here with my partner, John Lawrence. Unlike David Evans, who spoke earlier, John and I are both trial lawyers, but we spend a lot of time with directors and on shareholder issues. And that is why we are really happy to have with us Marc Goldstein this morning. Marc is with Institutional Shareholder Services, commonly known as ISS. He has been with ISS for more than 2 decades. Currently, he holds a position as head of U.S. research. But interestingly to our audience, I think he's also had previous roles as head of U.S. Energy and Industrial, as well as the head of the Policy Steering Committee at ISS. So Marc, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Sure, happy to be here.
So I think we want to start with just a few general things about what's been going on at ISS, particularly in this climate. But I think it would be great if you would just start out by explaining your role as head of U.S. research.
Sure. So I lead what we call the benchmark U.S. research team. It's a group of analysts who write the reports and the voting recommendations for U.S. companies. If you read an article in the newspaper saying, ISS opposed so-and-so's say on pay proposal or recommended that shareholders vote against directors for risk oversight failures, anything at all like that, that's the report that my team writes. Of course, as many of you know, we also have custom policies. Many of our largest clients don't actually follow the ISS benchmark recommendations. They use those as a starting point, but they have their own worldview, their own priorities, and they follow their own policy rather than ours. However, if they were 180 degrees apart from us, they probably wouldn't be clients to begin with. So it's not a matter of always coming out on the other side. It's just subtle differences here and there.
So like for everyone else, this has not been a normal year for ISS. And one of the interesting things that you all did to be responsive to the environment is issue a policy update in April, which was sort of out of time during the calendar year. Can you just explain that process a little bit, how it came about?
Sure. So as you indicated, our policy update process usually takes place in the off season. We start as soon as proxy season ends. And we announce our policies typically in November, and they take effect for the following year's proxy season. But this year, in the spring, it became obvious pretty quickly that there would be major disruptions to financial markets, to the economy, to society as a whole. And investors as well as companies wanted to know if ISS would just continue to apply the same policies, if there would be any flexibility there, if it was business as usual. And so we wanted to communicate where we would be flexible, both with respect to procedural issues and with respect to substantive governance issues. Now, this was a global document, the global guidance that we issued in April. It wasn't just for the US. So the key points differ from market to market. For example, in Europe, many shareholders tend to dislike virtual shareholder meetings. But this year, they were willing to obviously make an exception there and be tolerant of virtual shareholder meetings. Obviously, that was true in the US as well. In Japan, one big issue is dividends. Shareholders were being asked to vote on dividends in some cases without an audited financial statement. So what is ISS going to do? Are we just going to rubber stamp a dividend proposal? Well, no, we can't really do that. In the US, one of the big issues was poison pills. A lot of companies wanted to know if we would be more flexible in our policy and our vote recommendations with respect to poison pills.
Just really quickly to follow up on that. So you issued this policy in April, and that's available for folks to see.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, it's on our website.
Great.
Like all of our policies, by the way.
Right. Great.
Yeah, Marc, the other release you all put out every year that I know we look forward to and our clients are always waiting to see is the Global Policy Survey, where you all survey your clients and others about their views on the world. I know that every year you tailor that to the circumstances, but I can't imagine that there have been many years where it had to be quite so tailored as this year. Curious how that's going and how that process is looking different this year.
Yes, so we're right now hard at work compiling the results, editing the write-up, and we hope to publish the report of the survey results shortly. I can't give you an exact date, but I did do my round of edits earlier this week. As you said, several of the questions on this year's survey specifically related to the pandemic and corporate response to it. For one thing, we found that a majority of respondents want us to continue that special COVID policy guidance, the document that we were just discussing, at least in those countries and those industries where the impact of the pandemic is not yet over. When it comes to compensation adjustments stemming from the pandemic, that was another big topic both on the survey and on investors' minds right now. Companies want to have the flexibility to make reasonable adjustments to performance metrics and expectations. That's kind of understandable. Investors don't necessarily disagree with that, but they want boards to be thoughtful in how they go about making such adjustments, and they want boards to be transparent in how they disclose them.
And I think you all survey not only investors but also non-investors. Could you explain some of that? And it sounds like good news for our viewers today that you have some initial results that you'll be able to share with us today as we talk through these issues.
Yes, yes, I do. I can give you some of the more interesting results. The survey every year is open to institutional investors and to non-investors. When we lump corporations, directors, comp consultants, law firms, everybody who's not an investor, we kind of lump them in the non-investor category. And we always, the survey is always open to everyone. We do report the results separately, so we aggregate the investor results and the non-investor results separately, and that's how we report them.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to hearing a little bit of a sneak peek today about some of those survey results as we go through some more topics. So one of the things that we wanted to start with is ESG. As many of our audience members know, we've been holding this forum for a couple years now, and ESG has been a hot topic for directors and I think many of us, particularly in March and April, we were sort of going back to basics. With our families, it was sort of, back to very basic things, family dinners, et cetera. And so I think there was some thought about, how will this impact ESG? How will the current environment impact these ESG efforts that have been such a focus? Will investors sort of move away from caring about these issues and just kind of go back to basics? Things like, focus on earnings, et cetera. I'm curious your view, whether that held true or whether it's been the opposite.
Yeah, it didn't really happen that way. And one piece of evidence for that is the fact that 20 environmental and social shareholder proposals won majority support this year in the US. That shattered the previous record, which was, I believe, 12. What does that mean? It means that these issues resonated with mainstream asset managers, not just SRI-oriented or ESG-oriented investors, but the mainstream asset managers who determine vote outcomes at most US companies.
So you said there were 20 shareholder proposals this year on ESG issues. So definitely still a focus. Can you give us any color on those proposals? What did they look like?
Sure. So there, of the 20 that won majority support, there were about half a dozen that had to do with lobbying and political contributions, those kinds of issues. There were almost as many that had to do with environment and climate-related issues. Human capital management, human rights were also big topics. And the companies where these proposals won majority support were really in a wide range of industries, everything from energy to technology to logistics to healthcare. It really spanned the entire range of the economy.
So big picture, and as we've been through the events of the last 6 months, whether it's the pandemic, the racial justice issues that the nation is facing, where do you think investors are on these ESG issues, and explain sort of your view of the evolution of the views during this time?
Well, if you're a long-term investor like a pension fund, and especially if you're indexed and you can't choose which companies to buy and sell, you're in for the long haul. You want to be sure that the companies in your portfolio will be around 20 or 30 or 50 years from now. And companies that mishandle environmental and social issues are exposing themselves to regulatory risk, to litigation risk, to higher insurance premiums. They risk consumer boycotts. They risk losing their appeal to investors and to employees. All of these things can drive up costs and drive down profits. So proper management of ESG issues is risk mitigation. It's not, hippie tree hugging nonsense. It relates to the bottom line, and it's risk mitigation.
And so one more question on ESG generally. How did you deal with it in the survey this year, and what did you see in the responses?
Yeah, so one of the questions this year asked specifically about climate issues and if investors feel that the company is not adequately managing the risks from risks related to climate issues. What is it appropriate for investors to do? And solid majorities of investor respondents answered sort of an all of the above kind of approach. Engage with the board and management, support shareholder proposals if they're well crafted, obviously, and in cases where it's appropriate, vote against the directors. If investors view directors as not being on top of the issues and not appropriately managing the risks. We're seeing, by the way, climate concerns manifesting themselves not just in votes on directors, but votes on things like independent shareholder proposals, and on proposals related to compensation. We see shareholder proposals trying to get companies to tie compensation to environmental metrics, environmental performance, and perhaps to stop tying compensation to things like replenishment of reserves in the energy sector.
In addition to the climate, Jessica touched on it, and we heard Richard Fisher talk about it a little bit in our prior panel. The impact of the racial and social justice, movements on all aspects of society, customers, employees, shareholders. How are you seeing those issues manifest themselves in how shareholders are dealing with and what they're asking of from these companies?
Yes, so it's very much on people's minds, as you can imagine, and it is increasing the emphasis on board diversity and executive diversity. A lot of companies came out with public expressions of support for Black Lives Matter, and that has caused people to take a look at companies' own performance. Well, what are you doing on this issue? Your executive team looks awfully white. Your board looks awfully white. And so companies are going to be increasingly challenged to perform better on those issues. We had some roundtable discussions with directors and with shareholders. One of the topics discussed was, in fact, racial and ethnic diversity on boards. Investors do run into one obstacle, which is that disclosure is not mandated. Disclosure of the ethnic and racial composition of boards is not mandated, and not every company does it. Not every director is comfortable having that information disclosed. It's not always that the company is refusing. Sometimes the directors themselves don't like to see it disclosed. But there are cases where the information isn't available, and that certainly gets in the way of applying a strict policy. But shareholders care about this topic, and even if they don't incorporate it into their voting policy, they're going to be engaging with boards and engaging with management teams on this issue more and more going forward.
We've seen in California 2 years ago, California passed the Women on Boards law requiring gender diversity on boards. And this year we've seen the passage by the legislature, at least, of a similar statute on racial diversity. It has not yet been signed. Not clear if it will be. Is that the sort of thing that you're seeing investors push for? Is that the sort of, have you had discussions with your clients about those issues?
You know, some investors probably do support it, but the legal developments in California aren't really being driven primarily by investors. I kind of feel that investors would prefer a market-based approach. For example, lots of engagement from shareholders, suggestions. Hey, look, you know, not every director has to be a current CEO or a former CEO. Maybe widen your parameters, search parameters a bit, look at younger rising star executives or people who serve on the boards of a university or a nonprofit organization, that kind of thing. It does also mean that in some cases, shareholders will vote against directors, though, if the board is just seen as unwilling to budge. But I do think that for the most part, investors would prefer that to a legal mandate. And by the way, one of the participants in our roundtable earlier this week was a veteran Black director himself, and his point of view was this is something that the corporate community and the investor community need to get right, because if we don't, then it'll be mandated by law, and then companies and investors may not like the results of that.
One manner in which we've seen at least some investors try to push this, there have been lawsuits recently filed against Oracle, Facebook, The Gap, where investors have sued companies, sued the directors, saying that they are breaching their fiduciary duties by not having racial diversity on the board. And some of those lawsuits are actually seeking to have the courts require directors to step down in order to allow racially diverse directors to replace those directors who would step down. Is that something you're seeing, you know, broad support from investors? Something you're hearing investors talk about in institutions, or is it?
Yeah, I'm not hearing people talk about it. I personally think, and I believe many of our clients would agree, that lawsuits like that are going to be counterproductive. It's just going to mean that companies will be less likely to make commitments to improve diversity, lest they get sued for failing to live up to them. Look, shareholders do want to see greater board refreshment as a way to improve diversity, but they want to see that through age limits, tenure limits, regular self-assessment by boards. They don't want to see existing directors just summarily kicked off the board because they're white. They do want to see Black and Asian and Latino directors or candidates get seriously considered when there's an opening. But even where shareholders are willing to vote against directors, which in some cases they are, there's a big difference between a carefully aimed protest vote and legally mandated board refreshment, kicking off directors to make room for new appointees. And I don't think most investors would support that.
So to tie in a bow these ESG issues, you've referred in our conversations leading up to this discussion the need for the focus on these ESG issues as risk mitigation. I thought that might be a nice way to tie that up before we move to a different topic. Can you tell us what you meant by using that phrase?
Yeah, so it's again companies that get it wrong on these issues are increasingly going to find that regulators and plaintiffs' lawyers and investors and employees and customers are going to punish them, and so companies really have to get these issues right in order to have a viable, sustainable business, in order to be able to keep attracting the best talent to work for these companies, in order for customers to keep wanting to do business with them, in order to maintain their social license to operate, if you will.
Yep.
And all of these do directly relate to the bottom line.
Yep. So shifting gears just a little bit, wanted to go back to the policy guidance that was released in April and hone in on a specific topic. You guys at ISS decided to address the topic of poison pills in that policy guidance. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and why you chose to specifically address that issue at that time.
Sure. So we saw really a surge of poison pill adoptions, more than 50 of them this spring. In some cases, companies saw their share price drop by more than 50% in a matter of about 2 weeks. And it's kind of understandable that many of those companies would have felt vulnerable to an opportunistic accumulation of shares, if not an outright hostile bid. The vast majority of these pandemic pills, as we call them, weren't actually put to a vote. But shareholders did have to vote on the re-election of the directors who adopted the pills. And we felt that it was appropriate to look carefully, case by case, and do an analysis of the terms of the pill itself, the board's stated rationale for adopting it, the extent to which the share price had declined and the company was vulnerable, the presence or the absence of activist investors in the stock, and the company's track record on governance and accountability, as well as any other factors that are relevant. We ended up supporting the directors at a majority of these companies, but there were a few cases where the company essentially panicked, set an absurdly low trigger threshold, really pushing the envelope, 5%, for example, or where the board just failed to provide a rationale for the pill. Maybe they assumed that it was self-evident, but no, it's not. And there were a couple of cases, very few, where the company just had a track record that really was evidence that this board, this company, is not to be trusted. So 6 months in to when the world really changed for all of us, what are you seeing in terms of investor reactions to your recommendation, which is generally to be supportive of these actions in terms of poison pills? Yeah, so most of the directors who adopted these short-term pills didn't, in fact, see serious opposition, and investors were generally understanding. But again, it really is a case-by-case analysis for our clients as well as for us. When shareholders were voting on the directors, in a lot of cases, share prices had already recovered. Most companies' shares are trading above their levels in March and April, certainly. And so it's easy to see that an opportunistic takeover back then would not have been in shareholders' interest. But shareholders also know that true hostile takeovers are rare, and poison pills are in fact used as a defense against activists as much as anything else. So even shareholders who themselves would never file a 13D may not want companies to get too complacent, may not want this protection to last indefinitely. If companies try to renew their short-term pills next spring when they're due to expire, they're no longer going to be short-term at that point, and then shareholders are likely to be less forgiving. They're going to want to see a lot more evidence that the company is really at risk and that their interests are being protected. But a lot will depend really on what happens with the coronavirus between now and then. Some industries have clearly not recovered. Some companies clearly have not recovered, whereas others have recovered nicely.
So is it fair to say, sort of on a going forward basis from where we stand now, the read you're getting from investors is that it's going to become more and more of a case-by-case basis as opposed to back in April, which sort of everybody understood what was going on and there was broad impact?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that investors will be scrutinizing the individual circumstances at companies quite closely next year if there are new pills adopted or existing pills extended.
Yeah. The other decision, Marc, that a lot of companies face when we see what we saw back in April, which is large share declines, is what to do about share buyback programs, whether to institute new programs or to invoke existing programs. I generally think of share buyback programs as something that, when appropriate, investors like. How did the environment this year play into, in effect, that the normal decision process for investors as to whether they would support or approve of buyback programs?
Yeah, so I'll say at the beginning, most U.S. companies don't have to put these to a vote. The board just simply decides. There are two categories of companies that do have to put them to a vote in the U.S. One is banks that are required by their regulators to do so. A couple of states require banks chartered in those states to put buybacks to a vote, for example. And the other is foreign incorporated companies that may be traded only in the U.S., but because of their incorporation in the U.K. or the Netherlands, they are required by law to put them to a vote. So we had to opine on these proposals at companies like that. But for the most part, it was the board that made the decision. And, there have been sort of rumblings of a backlash against share buybacks even before the pandemic hit. Really after the tax reform in 2017, when companies spent the bulk of their tax savings to buy back shares, that triggered some criticism, among other things. Those voices got even louder when the airline industry was bailed out. People pointed out that the industry collectively had spent an equivalent amount on buybacks in recent years to what they were now getting in the form of bailouts. Investors don't view these monolithically. A company like Apple has more cash than it can possibly spend on R&D or acquisitions, so it should be returning a lot of that to shareholders, and the pandemic hasn't really changed that. And then there are companies like GE, which just wasted billions on buybacks and ended up with nothing to show for it in terms of the stock price. In the current market, I think investors will understand if, for example, the big banks stop buying back shares because of uncertainty as to how their loan portfolios will perform. And investors also understand that if a company keeps buying back shares while it's laying off workers or cutting their pay, there's a risk of reputational damage or a regulatory backlash, which ultimately will not be in shareholders' interest. Those risks are only magnified if the buybacks enable the company to meet earnings per share targets so that executives can get their bonuses at a time when workers and shareholders are suffering.
For those companies where investor formal approval is not required for those programs, how are investors trying to make their interests and make their desires known at this time?
Yeah, I would imagine it's primarily through engagement with the boards and management teams. Whether shareholders would actually vote against directors because of a buyback, that's unclear at this point. But certainly I would expect them to get an earful from investors when companies do their typical post-season outreach.
So another way in which this unusual year has affected things going on at companies is something that you just touched on, and that is executive compensation. How, in your view, do companies react to the current environment and deal with investors' concerns over executive compensation?
Yeah, so a significant majority of investor respondents to our survey, and by significant I mean 70%, indicated that the impact of the pandemic on the economy, on employees, customers, communities, the role of any bailouts or government-sponsored loans should be considered by boards, incorporated thoughtfully into compensation decisions, such as adjusting pay or adjusting performance expectations, and then should be clearly disclosed to shareholders. We are holding client roundtable discussions on compensation as well, one today, one yesterday, and these pandemic-related adjustments are the main topic. I think where companies are most likely to get in trouble is where they sort of panicked back in March and April, canceled existing stock options, granted new ones at what turned out to be the absolute low point for the shares, and where executives therefore potentially reaped a windfall when share prices recovered. Companies are going to look bad in those circumstances. They acted far too quickly. And rashly in some cases. For companies that adjust performance metrics, again, the devil's in the details. So how much did you adjust them? How well is this explained? What was the ultimate impact on the payouts? If companies adjust the metrics and then pay out above target at a time when share prices haven't completely recovered, that's just asking for shareholders really to vote against the program.
I know one of the things that you mentioned when we were discussing this issue is the importance of disclosure related to these issues. And what it sounds like to me, but I'm curious your thoughts, is that the pandemic is having a real disparate impact on companies. And so this is an issue in which there really is not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. And so in that kind of environment, it sounds like you've commented that disclosure is increasingly important to shareholders. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. Look, the big tech companies came through this very well, at least so far. Certainly their share prices are above their pre-pandemic levels. They've benefited to some extent from the switch to remote working and online shopping and everything else, and people having nothing better to do but play video games all day. And then there's the airline industry, the rental cars and hotels and travel, generally cruise lines, restaurants, movie theaters. There are huge swaths of the economy, retail, other than online retail, that are still doing poorly and are struggling to survive. And investors don't just lump them all in together in the same category. And they expect a different response, whether it's buying back shares or whether it's adjusting compensation or whether it's anything else. They expect a different response from companies depending on the industry that they're in.
One question I know everybody wants the answer to that I know you cannot answer is, when will life get back to normal? So I won't ask that question, but I know the question that we also all ask ourselves is, what will normal be? I think we all recognize that things we've learned in the last 6 months and in the next however many months about remote work and remote meetings and issues that have faced our country and climate change and racial justice. How will those issues that have had an impact for the last few months have a continuing impact even when we go back to normal life? What are your thoughts on of all of the kind of pressure points and issues that companies have faced over the last 6 months and that investors have focused on? What of that's going to have, do you think, a lasting impact, beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the focus on board diversity and also executive diversity is likely to persist. It's not going away any more than the concern with gender diversity went away this year. That's still on people's minds. Racial diversity is going to continue to be on investors' minds going forward, I think. Concerns about the climate, I mean, just look what's happening in California, look what's happening in the Gulf Coast, flooding, fires, record temperatures. These concerns are here to stay, and the pandemic isn't going to change that, and the end of the pandemic isn't going to change that. Concerns about healthcare, access to drugs, drug pricing, things like that. The pandemic is certainly highlighting those, but those concerns existed before it hit and will continue to exist. When it comes to kind of logistical things like whether to hold shareholder meetings in person or virtually, our survey responses were kind of interesting on that front. Investors, significant majority of investors want to see hybrid meetings going forward. They want to see an in-person meeting that's also webcast so that those who want to take part can do it relatively easily, and so that questions do get answered. Companies can't sort of cherry pick and choose the questions. Interestingly, among the corporate respondents to that same question, responses were more evenly split, but the plurality response was that companies want to go back to in-person meetings. And the least common answer among both categories was virtual only going forward.
So some sort of hybrid is what you're suggesting in terms of a going forward basis?
Yeah, look, I have to say that things went better than we would have feared, with respect to remote working from our perspective, but also virtual shareholder meetings. A lot of them went pretty smoothly, but some shareholders did report difficulty in submitting questions, especially if they tried to do it live while the meeting was going on. There are still proxy plumbing issues that haven't been resolved, and that apparently resulted in some of those difficulties. Shareholders couldn't prove that they were the beneficial owner.
So speaking of virtual meetings and questions from the audience, I want to, if you can just give a short answer to what I know is a very complicated issue. We had a question from the audience about competing proxy proposals and how ISS handles that internally. If you could address that, I know our audience would appreciate it.
Sure. So I think you're talking about proxy contests, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have a two-prong approach that we take to contested board elections. The first prong is that the dissident has to make a case for change, has to make a compelling case that change is warranted. And if the dissident can't do that, then it doesn't really matter how good their nominees are. We're not going to support dissident nominees if there isn't, first of all, a reason to make a change. But let's say the dissident does make a case for change. And by the way, we're going to review the dissident's arguments, management's arguments. We're going to do our own analysis of how the company is performing relative to an appropriate peer group, financial performance, operational performance, share price performance, everything. Well, let's say that hypothetically the dissident does make a case that change is warranted. The second prong of the analysis will vary depending on what the dissident is seeking. If they're just seeking minority representation on the board, not control, then they just need to demonstrate that their nominees bring something to the board that it arguably needs but is currently lacking, and that their nominees can work effectively with the rest of the board. So one example would be domain expertise in an area that the company is expanding into, but where maybe the incumbent directors have no prior experience because they were chosen for the board when the business model looked a bit different. If the dissident is seeking control of the board, then he or it, if it's a fund, will need to demonstrate that its business plan is superior to that of the current management, and that it has a credible management team that's ready to move in and take over. And so we reach our conclusions after talking to both sides. We have engagement calls, or in the old days, in-person meetings, sometimes more than one round of calls or meetings. We want to talk to the director nominees from both slates. We often have conversations with other shareholders as well, not just the dissident, but neutral shareholders, maybe our clients, to get their views. We're going to be evaluating the track record of the incumbent management team, the incumbent board, including its responsiveness to shareholders, including overall corporate governance. And we'll look at the track record of the dissident and the dissident's nominees, if they have any. We have a dedicated team that handles these analyses, by the way. It's our special situations research team. They specialize in contested mergers and proxy fights. That's really all they do.
Great. Marc, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time this morning, and it worked virtually, so we appreciate it very much.
Sure, I enjoyed doing it, and thank you for inviting me.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.